Night, and you were part of a team which we last night discussed with the 4 chief prosecutors of the Special Court of Sierra Leone, specifically dealing with the Charles Taylor case. And we specifically got into an awful lot of kind of behind the scenes, as this was not your normal indictment, arrest, and trial matter. And in fact, on all of them, I shouldn't say just Charles Taylor, but on all of the indictees.
Yeah, he was one of 13. People forget that. I mean, he certainly was the most notable, but we had 13, and we had 3 different factions that were involved in committing, war atrocities, crimes against humanity.
Yeah, a little give us a little background on you.
Okay, I was a federal law enforcement officer with the United States Department of Defense. I was the Director of Investigations for the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, which is the executive law enforcement agency in the Department of Defense. We were responsible for investigating and making arrests for those that were engaged in committing bribery, corruption, and major procurement fraud against the government of the United States, to include some organized crime. So this was a logical transition for me. Plus, I had a local street officer background. I used to be a police officer many years ago, and I used to also be a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, where I conducted a wide scale of major crimes, rapes, homicides, anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, counter-espionage, and counterintelligence issues when I was assigned with them. So I've got a 30-year background that was quite varied. And I have a PhD in criminal justice, so this is my love, and this is what I do, and I thoroughly enjoyed being a part of this.
How'd you catch up with the Special Court of Sierra Leone?
Well, David Crane and I were both senior executives working for the Department of Defense Inspector General, and we had an occasion to work some very significant cases, not the least of which was the John Deutsch case, who was the former director of CIA, and we were asked to look into a matter when he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, where he had disclosed unauthorized material. Now, Dave wasn't in a prosecutorial role, but in his role as Director of Office of Intelligence, he had access and oversight over all the intelligence agencies. So I was asked by the Inspector General to conduct an administrative inquiry into the mishandling of classified information involving John Deutsch. However, within 2 weeks, that turned into a criminal case, and Janet Reno, who reluctantly had not appointed a special prosecutor previously, had appointed one, someone that she thought that would not be very aggressive in pursuing this, and little did she know the guy that she brought out of retirement retired because of her. And so anyway, needless to say, we worked very closely together. We ended up charging him with 2 counts, felony counts, of mishandling classified material, and he was later pardoned by President Clinton for that. But the reason I bring that up is that administration was not very happy with us pursuing one of their own. So Dave and I took a lot of heat. We became very close friends, and we knew that we could trust one another because we had to testify before some congressional committees as to the cover-up and involvement of what happened to John Deutsch. So when this came about, the offer to him to consider being the prosecutor for Special Court of Sierra Leone, he asked me if I would consider being his chief investigator. So after much collaboration at home with my wife, I said I would do it, and I would do it for a year. And as senior executives, you're allowed to transfer to international organizations for up to 3 years, 1 year at a time. So I checked all that out, and we talked about it right before 9/11, didn't hear much, and you heard the story last night. All of a sudden he gets the call in April, and he said, look, I just got called, would you join me? And I said, yes, I would. I said, I'll give you a year, and we'll see how it goes. So in June of 2002, I was the first one to arrive in Sierra Leone, to find a place to live and work before we went back the following month in July to actually set up operations. So I did. I met the Inspector General at that time of the Sierra Leone Police in New York, who was attending a UN conference talking about peace and stability in Sierra Leone. It was all by happenstance. I met with him, and that was the best 3 beers I ever bought. And his wife liked wine. I bought Suzanne 3 glasses of wine, and they were very cordial and polite, and invited me to stay with them when I came over there. And they said they would help me find a place to live and work, and also run interference with the government of Sierra Leone, because after all, nobody knew anything about the special court other than what they had seen in writing, and really what this meant, and what the government's cooperation was supposed to be, and those types of things. And incidentally, he was under contract by the Department of Foreign and International Development, DFID, by the UK, as the Inspector General. They were paying for that position, so he was not a Sierra Leonean. He was a Brit, and he was a retired constable, so we had hit it off very well as fellow law enforcement people. So.
How did you sell the fact that you're going to parachute in with a whole compound full of people and activity? What did the locals think of?
Well, they weren't quite sure, although they were receptive, but they also weren't quite sure really what we were going to do and really who we were going to go after. There was a lot of skepticism. Although they were cautiously optimistic, there was a lot of skepticism in the beginning. That's why our outreach program was very, very important, which Dave talked about last night, which I think helped immensely. And then, of course, being able to deliver very quickly within 7 months of putting the cases together and then making the arrests that I made, and bringing as many people as we could get to. Of course, Charles Taylor wasn't arrested at that time. He was out of country. Bringing them into custody and letting the people know that the perpetrators had been arrested, to include the most powerful. I would argue that the most powerful man in Sierra Leone at that time was Hinga Norman, and he was the Minister of Interior that oversaw all security and law enforcement. And as David mentioned last night, he was responsible for the prison facilities, the one that the registrar's office had renovated, not knowing that he was going to be in cell number 8 of 9 cells, so on Bonth Island, which was 100 miles away from Freetown.
David talked last night about Operation Justice, March 10th, 2003. Alan White directed and arrested everybody who had been indicted from noon to 12:50. Tell me about the preparation for all of that. I mean, you got eyes on the ground someplace. How did all that work?
This let me back up just for a second to tell you how we put the cases together, which led to this.
Sure.
The people that I had working for me were a few internationals, but under the treaty that was signed by Hans Corell with the government of Sierra Leone was responsible for providing support, and that meant people. And when I asked Keith Biddle, I said, I cannot do this on my own. I'm going to need your help. And I'm going to need some people from your department seconded to me to help me. Not only is that by statute, but I mean, I know how to put criminal cases together. I know how to make arrests. I know how to do these things. However, I didn't live in this country. I wasn't involved in this conflict. I'm going to need your help. And I'm going to need it quick, because we're going to have to act very quickly, because our safety and security as well as the country. So to fast forward, he said, out of 8,000 people, he said, there isn't anyone I trust. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. He said, no. I said, well, can you give me your top 4 or 5? He said, that I can do. So he recommended 5 people to me. These were his best. And I interviewed all 5 at Keith Biddle's house, on the porch of his house. And I selected 4 of them. And the first one arrived on 14 August of 2002, the next one 2 weeks later, and the next one 2 weeks later after that. The reason why this is important is because what Dave mentioned last night, there was a concern about operational security and who knew what, and how that information was going to be compartmentalized. So Dave and I were very careful about the information that we shared. And quite frankly, most of the information was strictly between Dave and I for the longest time, simply because we didn't know who we could trust, not the least of which were the local people. And there were a lot of things at stake, not only our own personal safety, but the safety of the country. Because if we did not do this right, and if it leaked out, the country we were concerned about it engulfing back in civil war again. So to fast forward, we put these cases together very quickly, very methodically, but it was all about collecting human intelligence and witness testimony. There was very little physical testimony. So it was very important that we got in very quickly, understood the witnesses, convinced them why they needed to cooperate, and I couldn't just do that by myself. So I needed good Sierra Leone police officers that were seasoned. So the ones that I selected were very senior, very well educated, very well versed in handling informants and witnesses. And they were just extremely educated. One of them had a law degree, which served me well because he understood the common law practice, and they knew that what we were about to do was going to undergo international scrutiny, not just a national law. So we quickly put the cases together, but I broke it up in 3 task forces. And I had attorneys, because I'm used to working cases in the United States with task forces. The law enforcement officers run it. You have a prosecutor that's assigned each one, and you provide them the evidence, but the law enforcement runs each one of the task force. Yeah, you get advice, but we're used to running them because you want to keep the separation between the attorneys and the law enforcement agents, so that the testimony is not tainted later on, where they have to be called in as a witness themselves. That's why it's different. So that's the model we set up. So I set up 3 different task forces, one for the Revolutionary United Front, which we knew was a group, the Civil Defense Force, which we knew that although they started out as the defenders of the nation, they became the offenders. And then I set up a 3rd task force, which was on the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council. And then we had a 4th one that was a private one, which was the Charles Taylor case. So we compartmentalized the information, and I had an attorney working with my group of investigators where I oversaw, and they only had access to the information related to their particular task force. So that's how we set this up, to protect it for operational security. And Dave and I had made an investigative plan that we were going to collect sufficient evidence as quickly as possible to where we secured enough evidence to be able to charge them with a minimum of 2 counts. Not overcharge them, but in the interest of time, safety, and security, that once we had enough evidence to be able to make certain that we could charge them with 2 counts that would stand up in court, then we would move forward with the indictment. And that's what we ended up. Within 2 weeks of being there, I had, through one of my sources, I found out that one of the senior commanders of the Revolutionary United Front knew I was in town. He was concerned that I was in town. What was I going to do, and would I be willing to talk to him? And I met with him. I met with him in a hotel. This man had killed thousands of people. But for 2 weeks straight, I interviewed him in a secret location in a hotel room where he laid out the entire operation of the RUF, the CDF, and a link straight back to Charles Taylor. And that was a trusted relationship that we spent many hours together one-on-one collecting. So within 2 weeks, I had everything that I needed to lay out the command structure, the involvement of the RUF from 1991, CDF's involvement, the AFRC, and then the linkage, more importantly, right back to Charles Taylor. And then I developed other witnesses from that we brought in. And keep in mind, we set this up, we did everything from the basement of the house that we lived in for the first year. Because this was not a typical UN operation. We had to find a place to live and a place to work. So I converted the basement, which we found out later was a death chamber held by the AFRC, because they overtook this place in 1997, and they used to execute people in the basement of this house, which we didn't learn about until later. But it was a compound of about 3 acres. We had an 18-foot wall. We had Sierra Leone police on the outside, and we had a few close protection on the inside, but that was it. We had to rent vehicles to be able to go meet sources. I had to get the windows tinted so that they couldn't see me. Obviously, in Africa, I stood out. And I would go meet these people with tinted windows, and I would have a an SLP, Sierra Leone police driver, drive me to go pick these people up at a nondescript location, get in the vehicle. I would drive them back into the compound, have the informant or witness duck down so even the SLP couldn't see who they are. I brought them down the side of the house, blocked the side of the house off with some of my international investigators, and take them in the side door of the basement, which was 2 steel doors that we locked at night. And every time, because we had 3 offices down there in the basement that we converted into our operations center. So for the first year, that's where we lived and worked. And then once we developed enough information from these sources to be able to identify other witnesses out in the field, then we would go out in the field, which a normal trip here that maybe is 100 miles, it shouldn't take more than 2 hours, could take up to 12 to 14 hours.
Wow.
Because just the terrain, there were no roads, they were dirt roads, rocky roads, and sometimes we'd go through, almost a complete set of tires just going out on the mission and coming back on the mission.
How did you get your tips?
A lot of the tips were from the people that we developed early on, and in some of the Sierra Leone police that we knew witnesses as well. But in Africa, they like to talk to the chief. And since I was the first one on the ground, I was able to talk to these people and convince them that if you cooperated, that in most cases you wouldn't get prosecuted. And of course, that was in concert with Dave. So we were able to quickly on move up. And also I met with some other heads of state, which I'll talk about later, under the threat of indictment to cooperate, which they did, which they provided a significant amount of information to put this together. So from beginning in August till March, we were able to collect enough evidence to be able to indict 13 people, to include Charles Taylor. And as David mentioned last night too, with very few exceptions, when the people of Sierra Leone would ask us who we were going to indict, of course we couldn't tell them who we were going to indict, but invariably we'd ask them, who do you think should be indicted, based on what our mandate is. And we would educate them on what our mandate was, and that was we could not get everybody. They needed to understand that. And without exception, they would mention all 13, to include Charles Taylor, and it was amazing, because they all knew.
Who's the guy with the diary? David was talking about somebody who had a diary.
Jabril Massaquoi, who was the senior commander that I had talked with. He was a very well-educated, mostly self-taught, but he was a very dangerous man. He was a senior Revolutionary United Front commander, and we had traveled up country to visit some of the crime scenes, and one of which there were a number of buildings that had Go Away Massaquoi, and it was Jabril Massaquoi, to include Savage Waters, where allegedly 1,000 people were just killed on site and tossed into a small pond area, which we'd uncovered some body parts later on from. Very savage, but he was scared about going to jail for the rest of his life. He didn't know, and when I met with him, I had full authority to tell him that if he cooperated, he wouldn't be prosecuted. But it was a very tense situation. There were a number of interviews where I would be sitting with him, and we were in a hotel room, but it was a restaurant area, and there was knife and fork, and he would pick up a knife and start talking about certain operations. We were here, then we were here, and admittedly I didn't listen to much of what he said. I was more worried about where that fork was going to go. And then when he picked up a knife and started doing the same thing, demonstrating to me the various crime-based scenes where they had committed atrocities, I became a little nervous. But over time, we became very comfortable with one another. He trusted me, and then I had him draw out the whole scheme, the command structure. And he kept notes, but I actually had him draw it out in the days that we met, days and hours, draw out the command structure, who did what, where the crime-based events occurred, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And from there we developed witnesses from people that we thought would talk with us.
Did you work through an interpreter? I mean, did you?
We needed an interpreter, and this is where, in the early days, I did not have an interpreter until the first Sierra Leone police officer came on board. But keep in mind, there's so many dialects. I think there was like 36 different dialects in Sierra Leone that even the first one that I had, Thomas or Joseph Safa, he spoke Mende and Limne, but he didn't speak all the dialects. So eventually I was able to bridge that gap and deal with that issue, but initially I didn't. Fortunately for me, Jabril Massaquoi spoke very good English.
Okay.
He was literate, and he could write very well, and he did. And that's really how we broke open the case from the beginning, was with Jabril Massaquoi. And because he laid out the whole scheme, who was involved, linking us all the way to Charles Taylor. And then we started backing into the case and gathering other witness testimony and some physical testimony, or some physical evidence, which I was able to secure when I did a search warrant on Charles Taylor's residence, Congo Town, and the Executive Mansion, which is like the White House back here in the U.S., when I did that in Liberia, once we got him out of there. So we had some physical evidence as well as witness testimony, but unfortunately, because of civil war and the destruction of a lot of the evidence, we did not have the typical physical evidence. You might fingerprints or phone calls or things like that. The wiretaps that I was used to being able to use here to unravel sophisticated organized crime
So
cases.
he helps you lay out a board, basically the line of command and stuff. You're now able to, you and David and the staff, identify who bore the most
Who we think bear the greatest responsibility.
responsibility. Yeah. And then you just come up with a game plan of writing an indictment.
Drafting the indictments, and that's where at the time my counterpart on the prosecution side were putting together some draft indictments. What we'd made a decision, a
Was
collective.
Brenda there at the time?
Brenda was there. Brenda was working as a consultant, working for me at the time when she came on board for 60 days, and she was extremely helpful. Even though I had extensive federal law enforcement experience, and even though some of these crimes were very similar, the rules of procedure are somewhat different under the international rules of criminal procedure. But a rape's a rape, a murder's a murder, collective punishment, those types of things are very similar. But there are different rules of engagement under international law. And so we had to, that's where we needed some technical advice, and Brenda was invaluable. Because keeping in mind, we had absolutely no manuals to start from. We started completely from scratch. I literally drafted up witness statements, subject statements, rights advisement in accordance with the rules of procedure. I did that myself, drafting that up and making statements. And we modified them later, but we just, and without any admin support, these were things that we did. Electricity was intermittent. We had generator power. It would go out frequently. We had to get additional power brought into the compound, which satisfied about 1/3 of our requirement. So we had to get another backup generator. So we had all kinds of challenges all the time, not the least of which the rainy season. In Sierra Leone in August, it's the wettest place on earth. So these are all the kind of challenges that we had. Plus no radios. We used cell phones and rental vehicles that had about 100,000 miles on them.
My word.
So, plus we're away from our family. I mean, this was tough.
So you got the indictments, they're written, and you're at a point where you got to start strategizing that you're going to go deliver them to the court. Hopefully they'll approve them, and then you're going to arrest. How's that layout?
We knew in January, because I had left for a brief period of time. One of our key witnesses, who was a Taylor insider, was down in Ghana, and I had to go meet him. And I also, another insider was Taylor's brother-in-law, Sindor Reeves. So I flew and met with them in Ghana, and Taylor was at this point very well aware that the court, that Dave and I were in country, that we were operational, and I'm certain he knew that there might be some liability. So he started rounding up witnesses and bringing them back to Liberia, particularly those who were outside the country. He wanted to bring them back. And one of them was a senior Army general within Liberia, and he was in Ghana. And I had been in touch through one of my other informants that he would be willing to talk to me. So I flew down and met with him, and he had very good information that linked directly Charles Taylor to the RUF. So I met with him, and I secured a visa to bring him back to the United States, because at that time we did not have a witness protection unit. We were still in the throes of just starting everything up, and he was going to be a key witness, so I needed to bring him back where I could protect him. And my fellow federal law enforcement folks that I knew back in the U.S. could assist me as a favor, quite frankly, to protect him back in the U.S. And in the meantime, Sindor Reeves and his wife and young child, Taylor had sent a hit squad over to bring back the general, who was there for medical treatment because Taylor's son, Chucky Taylor, tortured him. Okay, stabbed him with a bayonet, butt stroked him in the eye, and grabbed his lower anatomy and tried to extract it. Just torture, and then took cellophane from cigarette wrappings and just lit it and melted it on his chest and scarred him. And I had pictures of that that were taken at the hospital that he gave to me when I met with him. So we got Sindor Reeves. I had Dave fly in a plane to get him out of there, because they were literally had hit squads going from the various Liberia refugee camps, because they were under civil war. The Lurd and Model were trying to get Taylor out, and they were fleeing the country going to Ghana. They were alerting the General Tarnu and Sindor Reeves, you need to get out of here. Taylor's people are looking for you, and they're going to kill you. So I was trying to get both of these people out of country before they were killed, and they were at the hotels at the same time we were there. So I was literally moving them from one location to another, to another, to another. Finally, I had Dave flying an aircraft. They picked up Sindor Reeves, and I had the help of a local, at the time, ICE agent at the embassy. He helped me. As
An ICE agent?
ICE agent that was over there at the time.
Yeah.
And I also had the regional security officer provide me some support, logistical support. So we were able to get Sindor Reeves and his wife. We evacuated them out of there. And then I was waiting for a visa to be approved, literally at that time it was INS, not ICE, it was INS at the time, Immigration Naturalization Service. I was waiting at the airport with the general, with Jack the Rebel, which was one of the hit squad guys, literally trying to come after us at the airport. And it was myself and the INS agent, and he kept them at bay, and I had to pay an additional fee to get the general on the KLM flight, and they bumped somebody else. I got him on the flight. The INS agent gave me the visa at the airport right before we left. I got him on the plane. We got back, and we landed, and the rest is history.
Wow.
And then I smuggled, he had 8 kids and a wife, so I had to smuggle his 8 kids through a surrogate in Liberia, one at a time, from Monrovia to Ghana. And then I linked them up with the State Department and IOM, which is a migration company, that up to international standards, and we got the magistrate's facility, which was right next door, which is where we would have to arraign these people. Then we started picking the date when we were going to do it. And of course, we gave the U.S. government a 30-day time frame, as well as we did the Brits, without telling them the exact time frame to get their support, because we were going to need their support. And as you heard last night, we had the British Royal Navy come down, and what he did mention to you, those were Gurkhas that landed.
Oh, really?
These were Gurkhas, and nobody will mess with a Gurkha. So 300 of them that landed, that was an additional sense of security
No, you didn't say that, yeah.
for that. So that was good. And then, of course, the U.S. government agreed to allow us to use their helicopter if we would need it for whatever reason. And so we had things lined up. And then, of course, I worked very closely with Keith Biddle, who was the Inspector General. And I didn't tell him what the details were until the night before. And the night before, we called him over. I briefed him on the operation because I was going to need his people to physically accompany us and to make the arrest. And of course, as you also heard from Dave, we alerted the UN authorities, the U.S. authorities, and the British authorities that we were going to take some significant action the next day.
Did you name names?
No, we did not name names. We did not name names for operational security reasons. And I didn't tell any of my people exactly what we were going to do until the next morning when I had them show up. And I collected everybody's cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody talks. Here's what we're doing. So the day of is when everybody knew, but it was compartmentalized into 3 different task forces because Taylor was obviously not involved. So once we'd identified that, nobody leaves, nobody makes any calls. When you leave, and only one person gets a cell phone when you leave here. So, and we'd had our sources that morning letting us know where all of our targets were. Our biggest problem was that we had the Nigerian ambassador. He was from Nigeria. He was the special representative for the UN Chief of Mission of Sierra Leone. He knew that they probably would be indicted, some of the senior members of the RUF, and he was trying to get them out of country. And we knew this. He didn't know we knew it, but we knew it. So that's what even compounded this problem even more. Because we knew if we didn't get him the first time, he was going to do everything he could to get him out of here. Because he'd worked with him, and there were some allegations that they were a little closer than what they should be. So we launched the operation at 12 o'clock. Our biggest concern was Hingen Norman, of course, and it was always the element of surprise. We thought about doing it early in the morning, late at night, but we thought the best way to provide the element of surprise was to arrest him in broad daylight in his office when he would least expect it. And at 12 o'clock, we started Operation Justice. We had 3 heliports with helicopters from the U.S. and UN ready to go. They didn't know why, but they were there. And within 55 minutes, I'd arrested 9 of the suspects. We had transported them back to the helicopters, got them on the helicopters, and taken them back to Bonth Island. Now, 3 of which we brought back, the RUF guys, and we separated them. And one of them started talking right away for a while. Issa Sisse was cooperating with us for a while. And none of them knew how this all happened. But Jibril Massaquoi was right in the middle of all this. So Jibril Massaquoi was the one that helped us convince these guys to be at a certain location at the right time.
Okay.
So it was probably the most nerve-wracking 55 minutes I've ever had, because if we don't get them, they're in the bush and we're not going to get them.
Right.
And they can cause some serious problems for us. So within 55 minutes, we had them all. They were en route to the choppers, and I called Dave and said we got them all without incident. And
So Hingen Norman, did he just capitulate? I mean, you walk in, how did that work out?
one of my Sierra Leone police officers, who absolutely despised Hingen Norman, because Hingen Norman personally killed or was responsible, and in some cases directed their death, and he knew this firsthand, 300 of his fellow Sierra Leone police during their days of wreaking havoc and committing atrocities when he was the Minister of Interior and the Chief of the Civil Defense Force simultaneously.
Right.
So when he went in to make the arrest, and everybody knew one of the guys that we sent in, and he was a senior guy, and in Africa they all snapped too. So they didn't suspect anything until he walked in. And then we took another senior police officer with him, and he said, "You're under arrest for war crimes." And he looked around, there was nowhere to go. He was pushing his button to summons somebody to come in. The button wasn't ringing. And they physically turned him around, handcuffed him, And he just looked at, his name is Tom Becky, the senior police officer that was working for me, who used to be the chief of criminal investigation. And he said, "Why didn't I know?"
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "You didn't need to know."
Mm-hmm.
And they turned around and left.
Yeah.
He was shocked, absolutely
I
stunned.
imagine.
Absolutely stunned. So once that happened, and we held the press conference, I went down with Dave as well. We went down to UNAMSL, which is where the United Nations Mission of Sierra Leone, where they had their press briefing room, and where he read the statement. Dave, myself, and Keith Biddle were there, and it was just a statement, no questions. And as you heard him explain last night, once they knew that there weren't going to be any questions answered, the first one bolted out of the door, and then they followed. And it doesn't take long for the word to get out in Sierra Leone.
Mm-hmm.
BBC was reporting on it, and nobody knew where we'd taken them, because we'd flown them in a helicopter and taken them down to Balth Island, which was a major surprise. So the element of surprise. And quickly people knew. All of a sudden the naysayers all of a sudden knew that we were serious and we meant what we said we were going to do. And arresting Hing and Norman was huge. The CDF and RUF and AFRC was significant as well. But taking Hing and Norman out, because everybody knew how powerful he was. And he also had a lot of supporters, because there were some that knew that he had committed atrocities, but they also thought that he was trying to defend the nation. But those were the ones that were more loyalists than realists,
Mm-hmm.
because the realists that knew the atrocities that he committed, same as the RUF. So that was a very exciting time. We brought him down, and all of a sudden the credibility of the court, nobody questioned what we were going to do.